Hi, I'm Michelle Fenton, and welcome to the Happitecture podcast. What would it take to develop resilient, sustainable communities? How do we design cities that support our collective happiness? Join me as my guests and I discuss how we can plan, implement, and foster places that allow us to flourish and grow. We're pleased to bring you this special two-part episode of Happitecture, where we join landscape architect and urban designer Derek Lee, partner at PWL Partnership. Excuse the noise as we decided to take this podcast recording outside in one of Derek's most treasured projects, Olympic Village. Due to the coronavirus, we couldn't do this in the studio, so we opted to take a walk around Olympic Village. Don't forget to check out part 1 if you haven't done so already. Hope you enjoy part 2. I think the public policy part is something that we're starting to see wane a little bit in Vancouver, specifically in terms of a consolidated community planning effort. It does seem that the excitement and the collaboration that happened, the intense collaboration that happened from a lot of different parties for this particular site hasn't necessarily been applied to community planning in the city. It's been mostly one-offs, and negotiations with specific developers, as opposed to a really collaborative, concerted effort to plan a community. We're looking at planning building sites now and not communities. And so I think the takeaway for me is, as a citizen, as an expert citizen, would be to convince our politicians or council that the success of this wasn't built on the shoulders of one developer negotiating with city planners. It took a concerted effort. It took planning. It took care, it took information, and it took all hands on deck in a way to what I think anyone anywhere in the world would say is a very successful end result, a community plan. So hopefully those that are listening to this podcast can start to communicate that. I mean, one of the things we wanted to bring out in this podcast is to actually equip the typical person, the citizen, with the language and the motivation to actually be a part of their city planning and to engage with their councillors and their politicians to say, hey, this is what we want and this is how we want to do it. Mm-hmm. And let's design this policy together in the interest of the community, in the interest of the public good. So I think it was important, and I appreciate your knowledge on this. I really appreciate that. I think that's something that we should really not lose sight of, that the grassroots efforts are great. They're exciting. We love the facilitation process, but really when the rubber hits the road, it's the policy that actually makes it work.
Yeah, I think that's really the key. There is an important balance between when you engage with stakeholders, when policy is set up, and when you continue to engage with the community. Mm-hmm. And it often, starts on sort of the one end of the spectrum, rather, where it's a very kind of open-ended form of engagement, right? I'm sort of a trained engagement professional as well, and so what we talk about is this idea of engagement and empowerment of people. Yeah. And I think that happens most effectively when there is no particular agenda established, right? Where there is the space to brainstorm ideas openly and allow people to explore things that may have never even been considered by decision makers. Mm-hmm. And those opportunities can really, truly be the points of inspiration to help shape our city. Yeah. Even before a project is even formulated.
That's right, yeah.
Because engagement will continue through that process.
And it should.
And it should continue. And then it eventually hits sort of at the other end of the spectrum where yes, there has been adequate engagement and input, that then it becomes more of an informed level of engagement on the opposite ends of that engagement spectrum, right? And so everything in between. One of the things that I've really been working hard on is creating entities for the citizenry, for the public to access community building initiatives in our city. And I've been a part of the Urbanarium now for probably less than a year. I was involved in earlier conversations with Ray Spaxman, 15 years ago when we tried to resurrect this. Yeah. It's obviously now been in full swing for probably, a few years now. I want to kind of say 5 years. I may be off a bit. But I was sitting down with Scott Hine at the early part of this pandemic. We started to brainstorm some ideas for how we can more effectively engage the citizens of our city. And we thought, okay, well, the Urbanarium does a great job already as a forum for conversations, lots of panel discussions, on urban issues and such. But there's one other aspect to this that we didn't talk about, which is the creative aspect of engagement. And we, with a lot of people, it becomes an objective decision-making exercise where people oftentimes throw up the barriers. If it's how much, what is the quantity, how high, how tall, how big, how small.
Yes.
Those are things that I think a lot of people have a hard time sort of visualizing and translating into reality. But one thing that people truly can identify and work together to determine is, what is the collective experience?
Right.
What are the qualitative things that I really enjoy in the city or elsewhere that I think could happen here?
That's right.
And that's why we decided to create an Urbanarium studio. But a studio to reach out and be accessible to the citizens of Vancouver and beyond, to really make transparent what is happening in our city and what can happen, and maybe having ourselves as facilitators to help people visualize that experience. Yes. So that's kind of I think that creative aspect of sharing ideas very openly, without an agenda necessarily at the beginning, and through the course of a project as it evolves, is really important. And so we're trying to figure out how that can become. We can evolve that from sort of an online status during COVID to maybe a food truck scale entity that's mobile, maybe something that's more permanent in our city, like a permanent studio environment, or I don't want to say a museum, but you know what I mean, a place that can showcase the city and build sort of a vocabulary for the general public, a language that they and a toolkit that they understand in terms of how these decisions get made, how cities are built, what the process typically is, to allow them to apply more informed decisions and comment in terms of what our city needs.
Yeah. And in a way, it's empowering the citizens of the place to actually engage with those creative minds, with those leaders and decision makers in a way that's constructive.
Yes, exactly.
And it moves the process along, and the process becomes that much richer because you're sharing a language.
That's exactly it, right? And now the city has been engaged in the citywide plan now. And so this is a big deal, right? I mean, I think that they're being very strategic in terms of how they engage, but lots of opportunities there too.
So you're moving on to, there's some discussion about Granville Street.
Yeah.
And they have already been planning for that. I want to shift a little bit because Granville Street is a very different scale. And how do you see that then starting to evolve with all the knowledge we have from the pandemic, from places like Olympic Village? How do we then apply the human scale to something that is inherently, a city scale, not a community scale? Yeah.
So Granville Street is a project that I was involved with before the Olympics. So we had started in on refacing the street. I'm going to leave it at that. Is we basically sort of did a bit of a reface.
That's right.
Of the ground plane, the furniture, the lighting, etc. But I think there's something deeper that was missing even in that process. And this is why I've taken a very keen interest in this, particularly approaching the Downtown Business Association, which has been incredibly proactive in trying to activate their public spaces during the pandemic. And this became a real interesting point of conversation because Granville Street is experiencing a real turning point. There's a lot of redevelopment that's now happening with a lot of the derelict cinemas and developers coming in and redeveloping. There's an interest in adding affordable housing, a lot of office space layered on top of the entertainment venues and retail space below. It's also a place that has struggled over the years because, to your point, it was more of a citywide or even a regional destination. Right. It sort of lacked a sense of local.
Yes.
It was where people would come from afar and spend a night on the street and then leave. And so this is something that we're really digging deeper into, is with the pandemic and the desire perhaps afterwards too for people to sort of embrace their own locality more and maybe be traveling to other places less. What does that mean for all the folks, the citizens that live downtown? And what could a street like that, how can that street be more relevant to their daily lives? There's been discussions about putting in a food hall, which could be really interesting. There's been discussions about activating the side streets and the laneways behind, in addition to even pedestrianizing large portions of the street now that the bus lines can be moved to northbound on Seymour and southbound on Hornby or vice versa, to really activate that more as a relevant space for the city. Mobile vendors, kiosks with, that could occupy the center line of the street, more generous cafe patio areas spilling out, public art, that could really activate the space. I remember during the Olympics, how Granville Street was activated with amazing public art through the street. And it just was absolutely magic. So I think it's those sort of soft programming initiatives to enhance the public realm that can really be achieved in the immediate term. And we've been looking carefully at partnering and working with the DVBIA and the city, and a lot of the business owners too, to help make this happen. I
mean, one of the things that is always something of a cautionary tale is when you start to look at larger scale developments, that smaller grain business owner typology starts to get removed because of economic pressures, to be blunt about it. But to be able to layer that granular piece onto something that like Granville Street will really change the ecology of it, I think. And to your point about bringing local people there, I think one of the things that we need to really investigate is the importance of small scale businesses to achieve that granularity. I mean, the London Drugs and the Bays and that sort of thing is also important as anchors, but it's really the small businesses that drive that culture and that sense of community. Really.
That's absolutely true. And if you look at a lot of entertainment streets like this around the world, there's usually a variety of different sizes and scales of businesses. You can have you may have some of the brand name businesses and larger floor plate businesses like the London Drugs and the Bay, etc. But you can layer into that sort of this more granular myriad of businesses. I mean, if you go into downtown Melbourne, you can see that. Just the local cafes. I mean, they're really fervently local. You wouldn't find a Starbucks anywhere. Right, but it's really that granularity. So I think those things can work together, and also kind of the vertical layering too. Like it's not just the ground plane. I mean, you walk into some of those projects in Melbourne where there's these beautiful cafe terraces that are multi-level. And I think that's really important to consider on Granville Street to make it more relevant.
Well, the scale can accommodate that too.
It absolutely can.
And so to just think about the ground plane is probably not sufficient in terms of and not appropriate. One of the things that, I look at, because my office is in Gastown, and one of the things that's really very special about Gastown is that sort of layering. So, you've got these huge businesses, lots of big IT and social media businesses are now occupying the upper levels of Gastown, but the ground plane is still quite granular.
Yeah, that's right.
And even though it is a destination place, the amount of local people that actually support Gastown and small businesses is remarkable.
Yeah.
I would say that most of the businesses there are supported by people who actually work in Gastown. And there is a real joy and beauty to moving through Gastown as a local and being able to support my local coffee shop or my local shoe shop, or, and you build relationships. And that, again, that goes back to that resiliency. So I think to see that come up on Granville Street, I think it will be a very exciting project, because I'm sure the scale alone provides a lot of opportunity.
For sure. Like, having grown up in Vancouver, I've seen a mass transformation of Gastown in recent history. Because Gastown was sort of that primary tourist destination.
Yes.
Certainly before COVID. And, a few years back, Granville Street underwent a major transformation too. We talked a lot. I think there was a Granville a Gastown Business Association that was set up that, struggled with some of the challenges of Granville Street and attracting locals. It was oftentimes there's a sort of a sense of transiency and vagrancy and all that was quite challenging. But the risk oblivious, those urban pioneers that came in to really reactivate the street, to turn it into something truly local, has been seen over the last, I'd say, maybe 5 or 6 years.
And I would say that initiative has actually made Gastown way more vibrant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So we can absolutely think about that on Granville Street as well. Also, the other thing I wanted to point out too is, how do you make a street more active? It's not just the street itself, and it's not just the adjacent businesses, but it's creating kind of these third spaces. Those types of interstitial spaces, whether moving through like an arcade, like a pedestrian arcade, into a courtyard, or those inside-outside spaces where like a food hall can open up. The whole side of a food hall can open up to the outside.
I can imagine it already.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that would be amazing. And being able to flow through even like a food hall or like a marketplace and access the lane behind.
That's right.
And activate the lane.
Yeah.
So it's those sort of third spaces and that porosity of a street environment that it becomes really important. The other thing too, not only on Granville Street, but other things, is creating a 24-hour environment.
Right.
Right, and that all comes down to ensuring that there's a sense of resiliency and diversity of uses that can be there through all courses of the day and night.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think there's an opportunity there as well, particularly as more and more people live and work in that vicinity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was prohibitive for Gastown and even Granville Street to some degree is the transiency, and a lot of people didn't feel safe there at night. And so that perpetuates this unsafe place. Yeah. And so when you start to, Jane Jacobs talks about this. This is really her true thesis: is the life cycle of a community, the life cycle of a street should be 24 hours, so that it becomes not just safe, it becomes vibrant, it becomes resilient. Yeah. And even though the nature of the occupants change, perhaps, and the uses change over the course of the day, there's still a critical mass there that actually helps to maintain its uniqueness and its vibrancy.
Creating a culture of diversity and inclusion is critical to ensure success of these public spaces. There's nothing wrong with the fact that people may be seen as urban campers in that space. Yeah. It's their choice to be there or not. Yes. Right? Yeah. It's their choice to be there within a diversity of others that would also use that space. If you are there with good intentions, you belong there. That's right. Right? Yeah. And so that, I think, is really the kind of culture and society we want to create in these public spaces. Absolutely. Yeah. To that point, one of the public spaces I've seen change over the years is Victory Square. Right. Like
the diversity of people that actually use Victory Square is quite remarkable. Pandemic aside, like pre-pandemic, you had people who were going there out of their offices for lunch. You had homeless people there. You had, groups of downtown East Side residents having little gatherings and that sort of thing. And so to see that expand and to see that diversity throughout all of our public space without the necessity of a security guard, per se, at every corner, I think it's one of the highest achievements of public space that we should strive for.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about we talked a lot about the democracy of public realm. And I don't know if you can speak to this, but in terms of well-being and mental health.
Yes.
The importance of not just public space, but well-designed, integrated, well-connected public space and its huge impact on the well-being of a city, the well-being of the inhabitants of the city.
Yeah. One of the things as a landscape architect is recognizing that we have an innate need to access nature.
Yes.
To access green space. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of scientific studies indicating that even having access to green space out of your window in a hospital, increases the rate of healing for people, let alone being out there. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in the context of Vancouver, we've been very fortunate because we've always had natural surroundings to inspire us.
That's right.
And allow us to appreciate that importance of having close access, whether it's going out for a hike in the nearby mountains or whatever. And that certainly has inspired us to try to integrate that healing quality of natural space into our park environments. Mm-hmm. And of course, Stanley Park is a great example of that. Yeah. And in turn, coming back to Southeast Falls Creek, the idea of a naturalized waterfront, creating an urban wetland in Hinge Park, where if you live here and if you're a young child living with your family here, you can go out and watch the beaver.
That's
or, the red-tipped blackbirds, species that you otherwise wouldn't see in an urban context. Mm-hmm. So there is much to be said about that element that is really sort of inherent within achieving high quality of health and well-being. I think also the social aspects of public space. We are social creatures. We cannot just be living in isolation all the time.
Yes. And our condos are getting smaller and smaller.
Our condos are getting smaller. And yes, we are on social media, but I don't think that is necessarily any replacement for human interaction.
Yes.
I also I like to talk about the digital world as being a highly fragmented world, where we oftentimes isolate ourselves in our echo chambers, and that's not a true reflection of a physical society.
Yeah.
When you're out in the physical world, there's all kinds of buffering mechanisms that we experience in terms of how we get on with people, right? That we cannot hide behind in a digital world.
Yeah.
And it's finding and creating human opportunities for human interaction in public spaces, real human interaction. Places that allow for spontaneous happenstance encounters where you can bump into your neighbor and have a coffee, or stand on a street corner or sit on a bench and have a conversation. Or places that allow a diversity of people to hang out in, because I think there's a strong sort of healing effect of children and elderly and all ages and interests in between to be together.
That's right.
And to foster a greater sense of understanding and tolerance and cohabitation. Mm-hmm. And so that's really, really important, where that is not so easy to do within the environment of a restaurant or a privately owned space.
Yeah.
We need those third spaces to allow that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not just old and young, but people who have various mobility issues and or modalities, and
the not just in terms of the psychological
health and well-being, but certainly in terms of the development well-being of young children to see that diversity and for it to be normal, I think does certainly build a richer society, certainly a more healthy society overall. Well, thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you wanted to impart on us in terms of, as citizens, how we can move our public spaces to a higher quality, a higher plane?
Yeah, I mean, be engaged, be interested and engaged in what's happening around you in our cities. I think there's all kinds of resources that would enhance our vocabulary and understanding. So I think that when we do find ourselves in a forum, a constructive forum for engaging on a project or on a vision, that you have the tools you need or the perspective that you need to contribute. And I think it's a dialogue. It's an ongoing dialogue. And I'm really, really hopeful too that we can improve opportunities for these very open venues to promote this sort of constructive discourse on city building. And that, I think, is going to be one of my focuses over the coming years to help that.
Great. Well, you mentioned Urbanarium.
Yes.
Are there any other forums that exist right now that we can direct our listeners to?
Yeah. Well, I'm also on the board of directors of the Downtown Vancouver Association, the DVA. And our mantra is engage, educate, and advocate. And so we've actually come up with opportunities to create roundtable discussions on a myriad of urban issues, whether it's housing and affordability, mobility and housing and affordability, or mobility and joy, or open space, public space. And these forums that are quite topical on these different issues are interconnected.
Absolutely.
That's the one thing about a city, is it is a whole number of very specific issues that do not exist on their own, but in fact are interconnected. And we as citizens need and want to understand that and understand those relationships, right?
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And where can people find that?
So you can go to www.thedva.ca.
Wonderful.
And you can check that out. It's either CA or .com.
Okay.
I don't have it on the top of my head.
We'll look it up. We'll put a link in our...
Send a link. But also the Urbanarium is another one. And also be engaged with your city as well. I mean, if you go on the City of Vancouver website or whichever city or municipality you live in, there's usually all sorts of opportunities to engage on planning projects and things that you should definitely access as well. Yeah. So
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you
it's a pleasure
on the
to be
podcast.
Here. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Okay.
And maybe we'll catch up another time.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take care,
Take
Derek.
care.
For more information on this or any other episodes of the Happitecture podcast, you can find us at happitecture.com. HAPPITECTURE.com. Special thanks to our sponsors, Cora Architecture and Interiors, designing places for being. Post-production by Vanessa Hennessy.